Sarah Martinez stood in line at the courthouse, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the summons that had arrived 3 weeks ago. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor where dozens of people waited for their cases to be called. She had never been to court before, not even for a traffic ticket, and the formal atmosphere made her stomach churn with anxiety. The citation had come as a complete shock. A neighbor had filed a complaint about noise violations during what they claimed were late-night parties at her apartment. Sarah almost laughed when she first read it, if it weren't so serious. Parties? She barely had the energy to watch television most nights, let alone host gatherings. The truth was far more complicated and painful than any neighbor could understand. Sarah was 28 years old, though most people guessed she was older. 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan had aged her in ways that went beyond the physical. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, revealing a face that had seen too much for someone so young. She wore a simple black blazer over dark jeans, trying to look respectable for the judge while staying within her limited budget. The noise complaints centered around what her neighbor described as shouting and loud sounds coming from her apartment between midnight and 3 in the morning. What they didn't know, what Sarah couldn't explain to anyone, was that these weren't parties or even conscious activities. These were the nights when the memories took over, when her dreams transported her back to the dusty roads of Kandahar province, and she would wake up screaming the names of soldiers who would never answer again. The nightmares had started 6 months after she returned from her final deployment. At first, they were sporadic, maybe once or twice a week. Sarah thought they would fade with time, like a bad cold that eventually runs its course. But, instead of getting better, they had grown worse. Now, almost every night brought the same torment. She would fall asleep to the sound of her air conditioning unit, only to be jolted awake by the phantom sounds of explosions and gunfire. Her apartment was a modest 1-bedroom in a complex populated mostly by young professionals and college students. The walls were thin, and Sarah was acutely aware that her nighttime disturbances were affecting others. She had tried everything she could think of to minimize the noise. She hung heavy blankets on the walls, bought a white noise machine, and even considered moving to a ground floor unit to avoid disturbing anyone below her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being cited for disturbing the peace when peace was the very thing that eluded her most. During the day, she worked as a security guard at a local office building, a job that paid the bills but left her feeling invisible. Her co-workers were polite but distant, and she had never mentioned her military service to any of them. There was something about the way people looked at her when they found out she was a veteran, a mixture of awkward gratitude and uncomfortable curiosity, that made her prefer to keep that part of her life private. Sarah's apartment reflected her desire for simplicity and control. The furniture was minimal and functional, everything in its proper place. She had learned the value of organization in the military, where chaos could mean the difference between life and death. But, despite the order she maintained in her physical space, the chaos in her mind continued to grow. The summons had been served by a deputy sheriff who seemed almost apologetic when he handed her the papers. "Ma'am, you'll need to appear in court on this date," he had said, pointing to the circled date 3 weeks in the future. "If you can't make it, you'll need to call the court clerk to reschedule." Sarah had thanked him and closed the door, staring at the official documents that felt like an accusation she couldn't defend against. In the weeks leading up to the court date, Sarah had done her research. She learned that noise ordinance violations could result in fines up to $500, and repeat offenses could lead to more serious consequences. The thought of having a criminal record terrified her almost as much as the nightmares themselves. She had served her country with honor, had received commendations for her bravery under fire, and now she was facing legal action for something completely beyond her control. She had considered hiring a lawyer but quickly realized it was beyond her financial means. Her salary as a security guard barely covered her basic expenses, and she had been slowly paying down credit card debt she had accumulated during her transition back to civilian life. Instead, she had spent hours at the public library, reading about her legal options and trying to understand what she might face in court. The night before the hearing, Sarah had called her mother in Texas. It was the first time they had spoken in months, and she hadn't planned to mention the court case. But something in her mother's voice, the familiar warmth and concern, had broken down her defenses. Mija, what's wrong? Her mother had asked after only a few minutes of small talk. I can hear it in your voice. Sarah had found herself telling the whole story, about the nightmares, the complaints, and the court summons. Her mother had listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or concern. When Sarah finished, there was a long pause. You need help, baby, her mother had said finally. This isn't something you should be dealing with alone. Sarah knew her mother was right, but admitting she needed help felt like admitting defeat. In the military, she had been trained to push through pain, to complete the mission regardless of personal cost. Asking for help seemed like weakness, and weakness had never been an option in her world. Now, standing in the courthouse, Sarah realized that her military mindset might not serve her well in this situation. She watched as other defendants spoke with their lawyers, discussing strategies and plea options. She felt completely out of her element, like a soldier without a weapon facing an unknown enemy. The bailiff called out names, and people began filing into the courtroom. Sarah checked her watch and saw that her case was scheduled for 10:30. She had arrived early, wanting to observe the proceedings and get a sense of how things worked. As she watched other cases being presented, she noticed that most people seemed to have representation, and those who didn't often appeared confused and overwhelmed. A man sitting next to her struck up a conversation while they waited. He was there for a parking violation and seemed much more relaxed than Sarah felt. First time? He asked, noticing her nervous fidgeting. Sarah nodded. You? Third, he laughed. I keep parking in the same spot thinking they won't notice. They always do. He paused, studying her more carefully. You look like you're about to face a firing squad. It's just municipal court, not the Supreme Court. Sarah managed a weak smile. If only he knew how appropriate the firing squad metaphor felt. In some ways, facing enemy fire in Afghanistan had been easier than this. At least there, she had known who the enemy was and what weapons she had at her disposal. Here, everything felt uncertain and unpredictable. As more people filed into the courtroom, Sarah noticed the diverse crowd of defendants. There were college students who looked like they were nursing hangovers, middle-aged men in suits who kept checking their phones, and elderly women who seemed more confused than concerned. She wondered what each of their stories were, what circumstances had brought them to this place on this particular Tuesday morning. The weight of her service weapon was notably absent from her hip, a sensation she still hadn't gotten used to after 3 years of civilian life. During her deployments, that weapon had been a constant companion, a source of security and confidence. Now, facing a legal system she didn't understand, she felt vulnerable and exposed in a way that combat had never made her feel. Sarah thought about the tattoo on her right arm, hidden beneath the sleeve of her blazer. It was an intricate design featuring Cerberus, the three-headed dog from Greek mythology that guarded the gates of the underworld. But this wasn't just any mythological creature. Each of the 3 heads bore the face of a fallen soldier from her platoon, brothers in arms who had died in an IED explosion during her second deployment. The tattoo artist had worked for hours to capture their faces perfectly, and Sarah had endured the pain without flinching, feeling it was the least she could do to honor their memory. The tattoo was her most personal and meaningful possession, more valuable to her than any medal or commendation. It represented not just the friends she had lost, but her commitment to carrying their memory forward. She had gotten it 6 months after returning home, during a particularly dark period when the guilt of surviving when they hadn't threatened to overwhelm her completely. Few people had ever seen the tattoo in its entirety. It covered most of her right arm from shoulder to elbow, and she was always careful to wear long sleeves or jackets that would keep it concealed. She had learned early in her civilian job search that visible tattoos, especially military-themed ones, could be a barrier to employment. More than that, the tattoo was deeply personal, and she wasn't ready to share its meaning with casual acquaintances or co-workers. As she sat in the courthouse, Sarah ran her fingers along the fabric of her blazer, feeling the raised edges of the tattoo beneath the cloth. The familiar texture was comforting, a reminder that she carried her fallen brothers with her wherever she went. In moments of stress or uncertainty, touching the tattoo helped ground her, connecting her to something larger than her current problems. The bailiff's voice cut through her thoughts as he called for all defendants to move into the courtroom. Sarah took a deep breath and stood up, smoothing down her blazer and checking to make sure her shirt was properly tucked in. She wanted to present herself as respectfully as possible, hoping that her appearance might somehow compensate for her lack of legal representation. Walking into the courtroom, Sarah was struck by how different it looked from what she had expected based on television shows and movies. The room was smaller and more cramped, with fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh, clinical appearance. The judge's bench seemed impossibly high, and Sarah found herself craning her neck to see the judge when he entered. Judge Michael Harrison was a man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had a serious demeanor but didn't seem particularly intimidating. As he settled into his seat and began reviewing the morning's docket, Sarah tried to read his expression for any clues about his personality or approach to these cases. The first few cases moved quickly, mostly minor violations that were resolved with fines or community service. Sarah watched carefully, trying to understand the rhythm and language of the proceedings. She noticed that the judge asked specific questions about each case and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the circumstances behind each violation. When her name was called, Sarah stood up on unsteady legs and made her way to the defendant's table. The prosecutor, a young woman who looked fresh out of law school, shuffled through papers as she prepared to present the case. Sarah noticed that she barely glanced up when Sarah approached the table, treating this as just another routine case in what was probably a very long day. Case number 2024-1847, People v. Sarah Martinez, charged with violation of municipal noise ordinance, the bailiff announced. Judge Harrison looked down at Sarah with a neutral expression. Ms. Martinez, I see you're representing yourself today. Do you understand the charges against you? Sarah's mouth felt dry as she answered, Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor began reading the details of the complaint, describing multiple incidents of excessive noise during quiet hours and disturbances that affected the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring residents. As Sarah listened to the clinical language describing her worst nights, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest that often preceded her panic attacks. She tried to focus on her breathing, using techniques she had learned from a Veterans Affairs pamphlet she had picked up months ago but never followed through on. The irony struck her that she was using coping mechanisms for PTSD while standing trial for symptoms of that same condition. Judge Harrison finished reviewing the case file and looked back at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, how do you plead to these charges? This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. She knew that pleading guilty would result in immediate fines and a criminal record, but pleading not guilty would mean explaining the truth about her situation, something she had never done in a public forum. Sarah looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the other defendants, court personnel, and few observers. In a few moments, she would have to make a decision that could change the course of her life. She thought about her fallen brothers, about the promise she had made to their memory, and about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy pack on a long march. Whatever she chose to do next would determine not just the outcome of this case, but potentially her future ability to get employment, housing, and the help she desperately needed. Judge Harrison waited patiently for her response, his pen poised over the court documents. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she prepared to speak words that would set everything else in motion. Not guilty, Your Honor. The words came out steadier than Sarah had expected. Judge Harrison made a note on his papers and looked back up at her with what seemed like increased interest. The prosecutor, who had been shuffling through other files, now gave Sarah her full attention. Ms. Martinez, since you've entered a plea of not guilty, we'll need to schedule a trial date. However, I'd like to hear if there are any circumstances surrounding these alleged violations that the court should be aware of. Judge Harrison's voice was calm but carried an undertone that suggested he had seen many cases like this before. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized this was her opportunity to explain her situation. She had rehearsed various versions of this speech in her apartment, but, standing in the actual courtroom, all her prepared words seemed to evaporate. Your Honor, the noise complaints are not from parties or intentional disturbances, Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge leaned forward slightly, indicating she should speak louder. I'm a veteran, Your Honor. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army. The noise that my neighbors are complaining about comes from nightmares related to my military service. I don't have conscious control over what happens when I'm asleep." A murmur went through the courtroom. Sarah noticed the prosecutor looking up from her notes with a different expression, and Judge Harrison removed his glasses to clean them, which seemed to be a gesture he made when he was thinking carefully about something. "Ms. Martinez, are you currently receiving any treatment for these nightmares?" Judge Harrison asked. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "No, Your Honor. I know I should be, but I haven't been able to. It's complicated." The prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with Ms. Martinez's service, the fact remains that multiple neighbors have filed complaints about ongoing disturbances. The ordinance violations occurred regardless of the underlying cause." Judge Harrison held up his hand to silence the prosecutor. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you willing to seek professional help for these nightmares? And would you be open to allowing the court to verify your military service and any related medical conditions?" Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The idea of having her military records examined in a legal proceeding terrified her almost as much as the nightmares themselves. Those records contained details about the incident that had killed 3 members of her platoon, details she had tried desperately to forget. "Your Honor, Sarah started and, then, stopped. She looked around the courtroom again, seeing the faces of people waiting for their own cases to be called. Some looked impatient, others sympathetic. In the back row, she noticed an older man wearing a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap who was watching her intently. "I need a moment to think about that, Your Honor." Judge Harrison nodded. "I'm going to recess for 10 minutes. Ms. Martinez, you can use this time to consider your options. I'll also ask the court clerk to provide you with some information about veteran services in our area." As the judge left the bench, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention and activity around her. The prosecutor approached her with what seemed like genuine concern. "Ms. Martinez, I'm not trying to make your life harder. But I have to represent the interests of your neighbors too. If you're willing to work with the court on getting help, I might be able to work with you on a plea agreement." Before Sarah could respond, the older man with the VFW cap approached her. He was probably in his 70s, with weathered hands and eyes that held a familiar weight. "Excuse me, miss. I couldn't help but, over here. I'm Tom Bradley, retired Marine, Vietnam." He extended his hand, and Sarah shook it, noticing the firm grip and the way his eyes met hers directly. "I've been coming to these hearings for the past few years, helping out veterans who end up in situations like this. You mind if I ask what unit you served with?" Sarah found herself responding to the man's straightforward approach. 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, 1st Battalion. Tom nodded knowingly. "Sky Soldiers. Good unit. Saw a lot of action in Afghanistan, I know." He paused, studying her face. "Listen, I've seen this before. Good soldiers coming home and struggling with the transition. The nightmares, the isolation, the feeling like nobody understands what you've been through. You're not the first, and, unfortunately, you won't be the last." "I don't know what to do," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "I never thought I'd end up in court because of something I can't control." Tom gestured toward 2 plastic chairs near the back of the courtroom. "You want to sit down and talk for a minute? I might be able to help you understand your options." Sarah looked toward the judge's chamber, then back at Tom. Something about his demeanor reminded her of her first sergeant, a man who had always been straight with his soldiers, even when the news was bad. They sat down, and Tom turned to face her. "First thing you need to know is that Judge Harrison is a good man. His son served in Iraq, came back with his own set of problems. The judge has seen what this stuff can do to families, and he's not interested in punishing veterans for something that's fundamentally a medical issue." "But I've never been officially diagnosed with anything," Sarah said. "I mean, I know what's wrong with me, but I've never gone through the whole VA process." Tom smiled grimly. "The VA process? Yeah, that's a whole other battle, isn't it? The paperwork, the wait times, the feeling like you have to prove you're broken enough to deserve help. He leaned back in his chair. But, here's the thing. You don't have to have an official diagnosis to start getting help. And, you don't have to navigate this whole thing alone. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was tentative and fragile, but it was there. What would happen if I agree to the judge's suggestion about getting help and verifying my service? Tom explained that Judge Harrison often worked with veterans who found themselves in legal trouble due to service-related issues. The court had partnerships with local veteran service organizations and mental health providers who understood military trauma. If you're willing to engage with treatment and you can show the court you're making a good faith effort to address the underlying issues, the judge will usually work with you. Might defer the case while you're in treatment, maybe reduce or eliminate the fines. And the military records? The court doesn't need to see everything, Tom assured her. Usually just proof of service, deployment dates, maybe a letter from a VA counselor or psychiatrist confirming that you're dealing with service-related issues. They're not trying to invade your privacy, just verify that this isn't someone trying to game the system. Sarah thought about the tattoo hidden beneath her blazer sleeve. She had gotten it as a way to honor her fallen friends, but it had also become a burden she carried alone. The faces of Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson were permanently etched into her skin, just as their memories were permanently etched into her mind. The incident that had killed them played out in her nightmares almost every night. Their convoy had been traveling a route they had taken dozens of times before. Sarah had been in the lead vehicle, Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson in the second. The IED had been buried deeper than usual, designed to target the heavier armored vehicles that usually traveled in the middle of the convoy. Sarah had survived because of luck, nothing more. 6 feet further back, and she would have been in the kill zone too. Instead, she had spent the next 20 minutes pulling pieces of her friends from the wreckage while waiting for medical evacuation that came too late. The official report had praised her actions that day, her quick thinking and courage under fire. What it hadn't captured was the guilt that aided her every day since, the constant questioning of whether she could have done something different, something that might have saved them. The thing about survivor's guilt, Tom said, as if he could read her thoughts, is that it doesn't care about logic. Doesn't matter that there was nothing you could have done differently. The guilt finds a way to convince you that you should have been the one who died, or that you should have been able to save them. Sarah looked at him sharply. How did you know? Because I've been there. Different war, same feelings. Lost 3 men in my squad during Tet Offensive. Spent the next 40 years thinking I should have been able to do something more. Tom's voice carried the weight of decades of pain. Took me until I was 65 to finally get some help with it. Don't wait as long as I did. The bailiff announced that court was reconvening. Sarah felt the weight of decision pressing down on her again, but this time she didn't feel quite so alone. Judge Harrison returned to the bench and called Sarah back to the defendant's table. Ms. Martinez, have you had time to consider the court's questions? Sarah stood up, feeling Tom's encouraging presence behind her. Yes, Your Honor. I'm willing to seek treatment for my nightmares, and I'm willing to provide verification of my military service. The judge nodded approvingly. Good. I'm going to defer ruling on this case for 90 days. During that time, I want you to begin treatment with a qualified mental health professional who has experience with military trauma. The court clerk will provide you with a list of approved providers, including some who specifically work with veterans. The prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, what about the ongoing disturbances to the neighbors? Ms. Martinez, do you think beginning treatment will help reduce the frequency and intensity of these nightmares? Judge Harrison asked. Sarah thought honestly about the question. I hope so, Your Honor. I want them to stop more than anyone. I know I'm disturbing people, and I feel terrible about it. I'm going to order that you check in with the court monthly during the 90-day period. If you're making good progress with treatment and the noise complaints decrease, we'll dismiss the charges. If not, we'll proceed with the case. Does that seem fair to everyone? The prosecutor nodded, and Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a chance, which was more than she had hoped for when she walked into the courtroom that morning. As the judge moved on to the next case, Sarah gathered her papers with shaking hands. Tom appeared at her side, helping her navigate the crowd of people moving in and out of the courtroom. "You did good in there," he said as they reached the hallway. "Taking that first step is always the hardest part." Sarah felt emotional in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The relief of not being immediately convicted was overwhelming, but so was the prospect of having to confront her trauma in a formal treatment setting. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted to Tom as they walked toward the court clerk's office. "You already did the hard part," Tom replied. "You survived what happened over there, you came home, and you're still fighting. Everything else is just paperwork and showing up." At the clerk's office, Sarah received a packet of information about veteran services in the area. The list included contact information for several therapists who specialized in PTSD, a veterans crisis helpline, and details about support groups for combat veterans. One name on the list caught her attention: Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who ran a program specifically for female veterans dealing with combat trauma. Sarah had never considered that there might be other women going through similar experiences. As she left the courthouse, Sarah felt the morning sun on her face and realized it was the first time in weeks that she had noticed something as simple as good weather. The weight of the court case was still there, but it was balanced now by something she had almost forgotten existed: possibility. Tom walked with her to the parking lot, where they exchanged contact information. He gave her his phone number and made her promise to call if she needed help navigating the VA system or finding resources. "One more thing," Tom said as they reached Sarah's car. "Whatever happened over there, whatever you're carrying around, it wasn't your fault. I know you probably don't believe that right now, but maybe someday you will." Sarah drove home in silence, thinking about everything that had happened that morning. The court case had been terrifying, but it had also been the first time she had spoken out loud about her nightmares and their connection to her military service. Back in her apartment, Sarah sat on her couch and rolled up the sleeve of her blazer, exposing the Cerberus tattoo for the first time in weeks. She traced the outline of Rodriguez's face with her finger, remembering his laugh and the way he always managed to find something funny even in the worst situations. For the first time since getting the tattoo, Sarah wondered if carrying her fallen friend's memory might involve more than just bearing the pain alone. Maybe honoring them meant finding a way to heal, to live the life they would never have the chance to experience. She picked up the packet of information from the court clerk and began reading about Dr. Hernandez's program. The description mentioned group sessions where female veterans could share their experiences with others who understood the unique challenges of being a woman in combat. Sarah thought about the isolation she had felt since returning home, the sense that she was the only person dealing with these particular demons. The possibility of connecting with others who might understand both terrified and intrigued her. As evening approached, Sarah realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't dreading the coming night. She was still afraid of the nightmares, but she was also curious about what tomorrow might bring. It was a small shift, barely perceptible, but it felt like the first crack in a wall that had been built around her for 3 years. She made herself a simple dinner and ate it while reading through the Veteran Services information. When it came time for bed, Sarah touched the tattoo one more time, as had become her ritual. "I'm going to try to get better," she whispered to the faces permanently etched in her skin. "Not because I deserve it, but because maybe that's what you would want me to do." That night, Sarah did have nightmares, but they were different somehow. Less violent, less consuming. And, when she woke up, she didn't feel the usual crushing guilt. Instead, she felt something that had been absent for so long she had almost forgotten what it was like, the sense that tomorrow might be better than today. 3 weeks after her court appearance, Sarah sat in the waiting room of Dr. Patricia Hernandez's office, her palms sweating despite the air conditioning. She had called the number from the court packet the day after her hearing, surprising herself with her decisiveness. The receptionist had been kind but professional, scheduling her initial appointment for the following week. Sarah had spent those intervening days researching Dr. Hernandez online, trying to understand what she was getting herself into. The doctor's credentials were impressive. She was a former Army psychiatrist who had served in Iraq before transitioning to civilian practice. Her program focused specifically on female veterans, addressing both combat trauma and the unique challenges women faced in male-dominated military environments. The waiting room was small and comfortable, nothing like the sterile VA facilities Sarah had imagined. Soft lighting, plants by the windows, and artwork that featured peaceful landscapes instead of the motivational military posters she was used to seeing. A coffee machine sat on a corner table, along with current magazines and what looked like journals written by former patients who had agreed to share their stories. Sarah picked up one of the journals and began reading. It was written by a woman named Maria who had served as a military police officer in Afghanistan. Her story was different from Sarah's in the details but eerily similar in the emotions described. The isolation after returning home, the guilt over surviving when others didn't, the way civilian life felt simultaneously boring and overwhelming. I thought I was broken, Maria had written. I thought the nightmares and the anxiety were permanent, that this was just who I was now. It took me 2 years to realize that what I was experiencing was a normal response to abnormal situations. The trauma wasn't my fault, and healing was possible. Reading those words, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. She had been thinking about her nightmares as a personal failing, a sign that she was weak or damaged beyond repair. The idea that her symptoms might be normal responses to extraordinary circumstances was both revelatory and frightening. A door opened, and Dr. Hernandez emerged with another woman who looked to be in her 40s. They spoke quietly for a moment before the woman left, and Dr. Hernandez turned her attention to Sarah. "Ms. Martinez? I'm Dr. Hernandez. Thank you for coming in today." Dr. Hernandez was smaller than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore civilian clothes, but there was something about her posture and the way she moved that immediately identified her as former military to Sarah's trained eye. They walked into Dr. Hernandez's office, which continued the theme of comfortable rather than clinical. 2 chairs faced each other near a window that looked out onto a small garden. Dr. Hernandez gestured for Sarah to sit wherever she felt comfortable. "Before we begin," Dr. Hernandez said, settling into her chair, "I want you to know that everything we discuss is confidential. The only exception would be if you express immediate plans to harm yourself or others. I also want you to know that I understand some of what you've been through, having served myself." Sarah nodded, still feeling nervous but somewhat reassured by the doctor's straightforward approach. "Tell me about what brought you here," Dr. Hernandez said simply. Sarah had rehearsed this conversation in her head for days, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself struggling to know where to begin. She started with the court case, explaining about the noise complaints and the judge's order to seek treatment. Dr. Hernandez listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes but maintaining eye contact with Sarah throughout her explanation. When Sarah finished describing the court proceedings, Dr. Hernandez asked her first question. "You mentioned nightmares. Can you tell me about them?" This was the part Sarah had been dreading. She had never described the content of her nightmares to anyone, not even her mother. But something about Dr. Hernandez's calm presence made it feel safe to continue. Sarah told her about the dreams that transported her back to Afghanistan, about hearing her fallen friends calling for help, about waking up screaming their names. She described the guilt that consumed her during the day, the feeling that she should have died instead of them. "Tell me about your friends," Dr. Hernandez said gently. "What were they like?" Sarah was surprised by the question. She had expected to be asked about symptoms and treatment options, not about the people she had lost. But talking about Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson as individuals rather than just casualties felt important. Rodriguez had been the jokester of their unit, always finding ways to make people laugh even during the most stressful situations. Chen was quiet and thoughtful, the one everyone went to for advice about personal problems. Patterson was the youngest, barely 19 when he died, but fearless in a way that both impressed and worried Sarah. "They sound like good soldiers and good friends," Dr. Hernandez observed when Sarah finished. "How do you think they would feel about the guilt you're carrying?" Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in months. "They would probably tell me to stop being stupid and get on with my life." "But you haven't been able to do that." "No.
Every time I try to move forward, I feel like I'm leaving them behind. Like I'm dishonoring their memory by living when they can't."
Dr. Hernandez was quiet for a moment, and Sarah worried she had said something wrong. But, when the doctor spoke, her voice was gentle and understanding. Survivor's guilt is one of the most common symptoms experienced by combat veterans. It's also one of the most misunderstood, even by the people who experience it. The guilt you're feeling isn't a sign of weakness or selfishness. It's actually a sign that you loved your friends and that their loss means something to you. Sarah looked up, surprised by this perspective. But, Dr. Hernandez continued, the guilt is also keeping you from honoring their memory in meaningful ways.
If they were here right now, what do you think they would want for you? Sarah thought about this question seriously. They would want me to be happy. They would want me to have a good life. Then, maybe finding a way to heal isn't abandoning them. Maybe it's the best way to honor what they wanted for you. This idea was so different from how Sarah had been thinking about her situation that it took her a moment to process it. She had been viewing her suffering as a form of penance, a way to pay for the crime of surviving. But, what if healing was actually what her friends would have wanted? Dr. Hernandez explained her treatment approach, which involved both individual therapy and group sessions with other female veterans. The group met twice a week and included women who had served in different branches of the military and different conflicts. "I'm going to be honest with you," Dr. Hernandez said. "This work isn't easy. You're going to have to confront some very painful memories and feelings. There will be days when you feel worse before you feel better. But, I've seen remarkable healing happen when veterans are willing to do the work." Sarah left that first appointment with mixed feelings. She felt hopeful for the first time in years, but also terrified about what the healing process would involve. Dr. Hernandez had scheduled her for individual sessions twice a week and invited her to attend the group sessions when she felt ready. Her first group session was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Sarah spent the week leading up to it feeling increasingly anxious. She had never talked about her military experiences with other veterans, male or female, and she wasn't sure what to expect. The group met in a conference room at Dr. Hernandez's office. When Sarah arrived, 5 other women were already seated in a circle. They ranged in age from mid-20s to early 50s, and Sarah could see traces of military bearing in the way they held themselves. Dr. Hernandez made brief introductions. There was Linda, who had served as a medic in Iraq and struggled with nightmares about the soldiers she couldn't save. Jennifer had been a pilot who dealt with anxiety attacks that had ended her flying career. Carmen was a former MP who had been sexually assaulted by a superior officer and was working through trust issues. Each woman's story was different, but Sarah was struck by how familiar their emotions sounded. The isolation, the feeling that civilian friends couldn't understand their experiences, the struggle to find purpose after leaving the military structure that had defined their lives. When it was Sarah's turn to share, she found herself talking about the loneliness more than the trauma. "I feel like I'm living in a different world from everyone around me. People at work talk about their weekend plans or what happened on their favorite TV show, and I can't relate to any of it. Everything feels trivial compared to what we experienced over there." The other women nodded in understanding. Linda spoke up first. "I used to get angry at people for complaining about things like traffic or slow internet. I wanted to shake them and tell them about real problems. But I realized I was isolating myself by thinking that way. Their problems are real to them, even if they seem small to us." Jennifer added her perspective. "I think part of the problem is that we're used to high-stakes situations where every decision matters. Civilian life can feel boring and meaningless in comparison. But that doesn't mean we can't find new sources of meaning." Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself looking forward to the group sessions. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, she was around people who understood her experiences without needing lengthy explanations. They talked about the challenge of translating military skills to civilian jobs, the difficulty of maintaining friendships with people who had never served, and the complex process of rebuilding their identities outside of the military framework. In her individual sessions with Dr. Hernandez, Sarah began working on the specific trauma of losing her friends.
This was much harder work, involving techniques like EMDR therapy that helped her process the traumatic memories without being overwhelmed by them. One session, about 6 weeks into treatment, Dr. Hernandez asked Sarah about the tattoo she had mentioned during their first meeting. "You said you have a tattoo that honors your fallen friends. Would you be comfortable showing it to me?" Sarah hesitated. The tattoo was her most private possession, something she had only shown to the artist who created it. But her relationship with Dr. Hernandez had grown beyond the typical doctor-patient dynamic. Sarah rolled up her sleeve, revealing the intricate Cerberus design. Dr. Hernandez studied the tattoo carefully, taking in the detail of each face and the mythological symbolism. "This is beautiful," she said finally. "Tell me about your decision to get it." Sarah explained how she had chosen Cerberus because of its role as guardian of the underworld, how she saw herself as guardian of her friend's memory. Dr. Hernandez listened thoughtfully. Cerberus was a guardian, yes, but what was he guarding against? Sarah thought about this question. Keeping the dead from leaving the underworld. Keeping them in their proper place. And keeping the living from entering before their time, Dr. Hernandez added. What if your role isn't to guard their memory in the underworld, but to guard your own life in this world? What if honoring them means living fully, not suffering endlessly? This conversation marked a turning point in Sarah's therapy. She began to see the tattoo not as a burden she carried, but as a reminder of the love and loyalty that had defined her relationships with Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson. The faces etched in her skin were no longer just symbols of loss, but symbols of connection and purpose. Around this same time, Sarah noticed that her nightmares were becoming less frequent and less intense. She was sleeping through the night more often, and when she did have nightmares, she was able to calm herself down more quickly afterward. Her neighbors had stopped filing complaints, and Sarah realized that the improvement in her mental health was having practical benefits in other areas of her life. She was performing better at work, had started exercising regularly, and was even considering taking a college course. During one group session, Carmen mentioned that she had started volunteering at a local organization that helped homeless veterans. "It feels good to use my experience to help other people," she said. "And it reminds me that my service meant something." This comment stayed with Sarah throughout the week. She had been so focused on her own healing that she hadn't considered how her experiences might be valuable to others. She began researching volunteer opportunities and found an organization that paired veteran mentors with newly returned service members who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. The application process required Sarah to write about her own experiences and explain why she wanted to help other veterans. Writing her story felt like another step in her healing process. For the first time, she was able to describe her military service, the loss of her friends, and her struggle with PTSD as part of a larger narrative rather than isolated traumatic events. When she submitted her application, Sarah included a photo of her tattoo along with an explanation of its meaning. She wanted the organization to understand that her commitment to helping other veterans came from a deep place of personal experience and loss. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a call informing her that she had been accepted into the mentor program. Her first mentee would be a young woman named Ashley who had recently returned from a deployment in Syria and was dealing with anxiety and depression. As Sarah prepared for her role as a mentor, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning in court 3 months ago. She was still dealing with PTSD, still processing the loss of her friends, but she no longer felt alone or hopeless. The community she had found in Dr. Hernandez's group had shown her that healing was possible, and the prospect of helping another veteran gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since leaving the military. The faces of Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson were still with her, permanently etched in her skin and her memory. But now she carried them forward as sources of strength rather than symbols of guilt. She was beginning to understand that honoring the dead might mean living fully, not suffering endlessly. Sarah scheduled a meeting with her first mentee for the following week, curious about what this new chapter in her life would bring. She touched the tattoo through her shirt, feeling the familiar comfort of her friend's presence, but also feeling something new, excitement about the future. 6 months after that first court appearance, Sarah stood in the hallway outside Judge Harrison's courtroom, but this time the circumstances were completely different. She wore the same black blazer, but now it felt like armor rather than a disguise. Her final check-in with the court was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and she carried with her a folder containing documentation of her treatment progress and a letter from Dr. Hernandez. The hallway was busy with the usual mix of defendants, lawyers, and court personnel, but Sarah no longer felt like she was drowning in an unfamiliar world. Over the past months, she had learned to navigate not just the legal system, but her own healing process. The nightmares hadn't completely disappeared, but they were manageable now, and, more importantly, she had developed tools to cope with them. Tom Bradley was waiting for her near the courtroom entrance, as he had promised to be. Over the months, he had become something like a surrogate grandfather, checking in on her progress and offering guidance when she hit difficult patches in her treatment. His presence had been invaluable during the early weeks when everything felt overwhelming. "Ready for this?" Tom asked as they walked into the courtroom together. "I think so," Sarah replied, and she meant it. She had spent the previous evening reviewing everything that had changed since her first appearance before Judge Harrison. The transformation was remarkable even to her. When her name was called, Sarah approached the defendant's table with confidence rather than fear. Judge Harrison looked up from his files with what appeared to be genuine interest in her case.
"Ms. Martinez, it's good to see you again.
I have before me a report from Dr. Hernandez indicating that you have been fully engaged in treatment for the past 6 months. I also see that there have been no additional noise complaints filed against you during this period. How are you feeling about your progress?" Sarah had prepared for this question, but her answer came from the heart rather than from rehearsal. "Your Honor, 6 months ago I was barely surviving. I was isolated, struggling with nightmares every night, and I felt like my life had no purpose. The court's decision to give me a chance to get help instead of just imposing penalties changed everything for me." She paused, thinking about how to explain the depth of the transformation she had experienced. "I'm still dealing with PTSD, and I probably always will be. But now I have tools to manage it, and, more importantly, I have a community of people who understand what I'm going through. I've also found a way to use my experiences to help other veterans who are facing similar challenges."
Judge Harrison smiled, something Sarah hadn't seen during their first encounter. "I understand you've become involved in a veteran mentorship program. Can you tell me about that?"
Sarah felt a surge of pride as she described her work with Ashley and 2 other men she had been assigned over the past few months. Ashley, the young woman who had served in Syria, had been struggling with severe anxiety attacks that were interfering with her ability to work. Through their weekly meetings and constant text message support, Sarah had helped Ashley connect with mental health resources and develop coping strategies. One of the most powerful things about the mentor program, Sarah explained to the judge, is that it shows newly returned veterans that they're not alone. When someone who has been through similar experiences tells you that healing is possible, it carries weight in a way that well-meaning family members or civilian counselors sometimes can't provide.
The prosecutor, the same young woman who had handled Sarah's case initially, stood up to address the court.
"Your Honor, Ms. Martinez has clearly made remarkable progress. The people have no objection to dismissing the charges in this case."
Judge Harrison made some notes and, then, looked back at Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to dismiss all charges against you.
But, before you leave, I want to say something about what I've observed over these past months." Sarah felt her heart racing as she waited for the judge to continue.
"When you first appeared in my court, I saw a young veteran who was struggling with the invisible wounds of war. What impressed me wasn't just your military service, though that certainly deserves recognition.
What impressed me was your willingness to accept help and do the hard work of healing." Judge Harrison removed his glasses and leaned forward slightly. "I've seen too many cases where pride or stigma prevents veterans from getting the help they need. Your courage in facing your trauma head-on and, then, using that experience to help others is exactly the kind of leadership we need more of in our community."
Sarah felt tears threatening and had to take a deep breath to maintain her composure.
After months of feeling like a burden on society, hearing a judge describe her as a leader was almost overwhelming. As she left the courtroom, Sarah realized that this moment marked the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. The legal case that had brought her to this point was resolved, but her commitment to healing and helping others was just getting started. Tom walked with her to the courthouse parking lot, where they sat on a bench in the shade of a large oak tree. It had become their tradition to debrief after important milestones, and today felt like the most significant milestone yet. "You know," Tom said, "when I first saw you in that courtroom 6 months ago, I recognized the look. That combination of fear, anger, and exhaustion that happens when you're fighting battles on too many fronts." Sarah nodded, remembering how lost she had felt that first day. "But I also saw something else," Tom continued. "I saw strength. Not the kind of strength that military training gives you, but the deeper kind that comes from surviving things that would break most people. You just needed help accessing it." They talked about Sarah's plans for the future. She had been accepted into a community college program to study social work, with the goal of eventually working full-time with veterans dealing with trauma. She had also been asked to speak at a conference about female veterans and PTSD, something that both terrified and excited her. "Are you planning to show the tattoo during your speech?" Tom asked. Sarah had been thinking about this question for weeks. The tattoo had been her most private possession for so long that the idea of revealing it publicly felt both meaningful and frightening. "I think I am," she said finally. "Dr. Hernandez thinks it might help other veterans understand that there are different ways to honor fallen friends. And maybe it will help people see that tattoos aren't just decoration for some of us. They're memorials." As she drove home from the courthouse, Sarah thought about the evening ahead. Her therapy group was meeting, and tonight was her turn to facilitate the discussion. Dr. Hernandez had been gradually giving group members more responsibility for leading sessions, helping them develop confidence and leadership skills. Tonight's topic was redefining strength, something Sarah had been thinking about a lot lately. In the military, strength had meant pushing through pain, never showing weakness, completing the mission regardless of personal cost. But her healing journey had taught her that real strength sometimes meant admitting you needed help, being vulnerable with trusted people, and choosing to heal instead of choosing to suffer. The group had grown over the past months, now including 8 women who met twice a week. Sarah had watched new members arrive with the same fear and isolation she had felt initially, and she had seen them gradually open up and begin their own healing processes. Being part of that transformation was more rewarding than anything she had experienced in her military career. Ashley had recently joined the group, and Sarah was proud to see her mentee developing relationships with other veterans beyond their one-on-one meetings. Building a broader support network was crucial for long-term mental health, and Sarah was learning that her role as a mentor was sometimes simply to introduce people to resources rather than to provide all the support herself. When Sarah arrived at Dr. Hernandez's office that evening, the other group members were already gathering. They had developed their own pre-session ritual of sharing coffee and catching up on each other's weeks. Sarah was struck by how much laughter filled these conversations now, compared to the heavy silence that had characterized the group's early meetings. Carmen had big news to share. She had been promoted at her civilian job and was being sent to a leadership training program. More importantly for her healing journey, she had started dating someone for the first time since her assault. The relationship was moving slowly, but Carmen felt hopeful about her ability to trust again. Linda had successfully completed her EMT certification and was working for a local ambulance service. Using her medical training in a civilian context was helping her process some of the trauma she experienced as a combat medic. She had also started a side business providing first aid training to community groups. Jennifer had a different kind of update. After months of believing her flying career was over due to her anxiety attacks, she had been cleared to return to limited duty as a flight instructor. The path back to full flying status was still unclear, but she was hopeful. As the formal session began, Sarah took her role as facilitator seriously. Dr. Hernandez sat in the circle as a participant rather than a leader, offering guidance when asked but allowing the group to direct their own discussion. "I want to start tonight by talking about how our understanding of strength has evolved," Sarah began. "When I think about where I was 6 months ago compared to where I am now, the biggest change isn't that I've gotten tougher. It's that I've gotten more honest about what I need." The group talked about the differences between military strength and civilian strength, between individual resilience and community support. They discussed how asking for help had felt like failure initially, but had become the foundation of their healing. Ashley spoke about her experience as someone newer to the healing process. What surprised me most about this group is how normal everyone seems. I expected to walk into a room full of broken people, but instead I found a room full of people who were working on getting better. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction hearing Ashley describe the group this way. It reflected exactly what she had hoped to find when she first started treatment, and what she now tried to provide for the veterans she mentored. Near the end of the session, Dr. Hernandez asked Sarah to share her reflections on facilitating the discussion. This had become a regular practice, helping group members develop their leadership and communication skills. "What struck me tonight is how much our stories have changed," Sarah said. 6 months ago, we all came here with stories about what had been done to us, what we had lost, what we couldn't do anymore. Tonight, we're telling stories about what we're building, what we're learning, what we're becoming. After the session ended, Sarah stayed to help Dr. Hernandez clean up the conference room. It gave them a chance to talk privately about Sarah's progress and future plans. "I have something to show you," Dr. Hernandez said, pulling out a letter from her desk drawer. This came from the mentorship program coordinator yesterday. The letter described the impact Sarah had made on her ments and requested that she consider taking on a more formal role in the program. They wanted her to help train other mentors and possibly speak at recruitment events. "What do you think?" Dr. Hernandez asked. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was balanced by excitement and purpose. "I think Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson would be proud," she said, touching her arm where the tattoo lay hidden beneath her sleeve. "I think you're right," Dr. Hernandez replied. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she followed her evening ritual of looking at the tattoo in her bathroom mirror. The faces of her fallen friends were as clear as ever, but her relationship with them had transformed completely. They were no longer symbols of guilt and obligation, but sources of strength and inspiration. She had been thinking about adding to the tattoo, perhaps including symbols representing her new life and purpose. Not to diminish the memory of Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson, but to show how their legacy continued to grow and evolve. For the first time in years, Sarah was excited about the future. She had a clear sense of purpose, a community of people who understood and supported her, and tools for managing the ongoing challenges of PTSD. Most importantly, she had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or moving on from it, but about integrating it into a meaningful present. As she turned off the lights and settled into bed, Sarah thought about the speech she would give at the Veterans Conference. She had decided to end it by showing her tattoo and explaining how Cerberus had evolved from a guardian of the dead to a guardian of the living. "The 3 heads still represent my fallen friends," she would say, "but now they also represent the 3 aspects of healing: remembering with love instead of guilt, finding community instead of isolation, and using our experiences to help others instead of suffering alone." Sarah fell asleep that night without medication or anxiety, trusting that if nightmares came, she had the tools and support to handle them. But, more than that, she fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring opportunities to continue growing, healing, and serving others. The Guardian's duty continued, but now it was about protecting life and hope rather than guarding pain and loss. In her dreams that night, Sarah walked with Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson through a peaceful landscape. They were laughing and talking about the lives she was helping to save and heal. When she woke the next morning, she felt their approval and blessing, and she knew that her journey from broken veteran to healer and leader was exactly what they would have wanted for her. The faces on her arm would always be there, but now they were witnesses to triumph rather than reminders of tragedy. The Guardian had found her true purpose.